But you had to travel a long way to see a good rock and roll band. I was imitating, you know, to be honest with you. I was copying what I heard on record. And that's when I realized that I had to develop some kind of personality of my own with my music.
In 1966, when Cream were on the rise and the British blues scene was blossoming, Eric Clapton shocked more than a few fans by declaring his admiration for an American group unlike anything else around. The Mothers of Invention, he told Beat Instrumental, "That's the best band I've heard in ages. I love what they're doing." It was an endorsement that raised eyebrows. The Mothers, led by the caustically brilliant Frank Zappa, were more known for their surreal lyrics, sprawling concept albums and sardonic humour than for anything that resembled the Chicago blues Clapton had helped bring to British audiences. But that was precisely the point. What Zappa and the Mothers represented was an escape from predictability, from formula, from the safety net of popular approval. Their 1966 debut album, Freak Out, was equal parts absurdist collage, social critique, and compositional labyrinth.
They won't go for no more great Midwestern hardware store philosophy that turns away.
Clapton wasn't looking for polished harmonies or digestible riffs. He was attracted to audacity, even chaos. The Mothers were doing things nobody else had the nerve to do, as Clapton later reflected in conversation with journalist Ray Coleman. They were irreverent, uncompromising, and totally uninterested in chart success, all qualities Clapton admired in an industry already leaning toward commercial conformity. Zappa's relentless innovation extended far beyond satire. He incorporated jazz, doo-wop, musique concrète, classical motifs, and R&B in sprawling arrangements that defied rock's emerging rulebook. Clapton appreciated the artistry behind it all. He once joked on stage with Derek and the Dominoes about Susie Cream Cheese, a recurring Mothers character. This wasn't just musical name-dropping, it was a nod to a movement that blurred the boundaries between high and low culture. While Clapton never followed Zappa into the outer reaches of sonic experimentation, he admired the purity of the vision. The Mothers' influence on Clapton wasn't direct in the way blues guitarists like Buddy Guy or Freddie King had been, but it was ideological. It gave him permission to treat music as a vehicle for provocation and playfulness, not just expression or craftsmanship. In the aftermath of Cream, where he was increasingly disillusioned by endless improvisation, the notion of subverting expectations became more attractive. As Zappa himself once said, "Without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible." Clapton would internalize that lesson, particularly when seeking ways to dismantle the myth that had already grown around him. The very idea of being Clapton is God was something he found suffocating.
People were writing graffiti, Clapton is God.
Yeah.
When you saw that, what did you think?
I was disgusted and pleased at the same time. I am an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. So I like the attention and I don't like the attention.
The Mothers showed him that another route was possible, one driven not by adoration, but by deliberate refusal to conform. This new mindset came at a time when Clapton was searching for an alternative to the cyclical blues structures he'd begun to find limiting. Make sure you watch until the end, where Eric Clapton talks about the popular band he wasn't a fan of. Clapton's enthusiasm for the Mothers was matched by a very different American band whose appeal lay not in provocation, but in emotional sincerity. The Young Rascals too, he said in the same interview. They've got a lot of soul. In the mid-1960s, the Rascals were one of the few American acts combining gritty rhythm and blues with polished pop songwriting. Their 1966 hit Good Lovin' cracked open the charts. But what set them apart was the vocal intensity of Felix Cavaliere and their unapologetic commitment to black musical traditions. Clapton wasn't interested in novelty, He was looking for something that felt real. And in the Rascals, he found a group that didn't treat soul as a veneer. They played it with conviction. Their take on garage rock was infused with the same kind of emotional urgency he'd first heard in Ray Charles and Sam Cooke. That they were white musicians interpreting black music wasn't lost on Clapton, nor was it a problem, provided it was done with honesty. What also stood out was their musicianship. Dino Danelli on drums had a jazz-inflected attack that lent their songs an unpredictable dynamism. Gene Cornish's guitar was clean but assertive. And Cavalieri's Hammond organ lines gave their arrangements a gospel richness. Clapton admired bands that played with both looseness and control, and the Rascals struck that balance effortlessly. But it wasn't just the sound, it was the sensibility. At a time when pop was becoming increasingly studio-bound and overproduced, the Rascals still sounded like a live band. You could hear sweat in the grooves. Clapton, who had come up playing clubs and pubs with the Yardbirds and John Mayall's Blues Breakers, respected that immediacy. Years later, speaking in a BBC radio interview, he said, "They had that thing, you know, when a band's just locked in, not trying to be clever, just playing what they feel. That's what I loved about them." It's perhaps no coincidence that when Clapton formed Derek and the Dominoes, he was drawn to musicians like Bobby Whitlock and Carl Radle, players who could move between soul, gospel and rock without sounding contrived. The Rascals offered a glimpse of what could be done with soul music outside of traditional R&B settings. This would become increasingly relevant to Clapton in the early 1970s, when he shifted away from lengthy guitar solos and leaned more into vocal-driven material like Let It Rain and Bell Bottom Blues. Their influence was felt not in mimicry, but in mood, in the emotional weight he sought to carry through song rather than solo. So far we've had Frank Zappa's surreal chaos and the Rascals' blue-eyed soul. But what do you make of these choices? Do they surprise you? Do they make sense given Clapton's musical journey? Or do they feel at odds with his blues pedigree? Drop a comment below and let us know which band you would have expected to be on his list, or which one doesn't belong. It would have been easy to assume that by the 1990s, Clapton had settled into the role of elder statesman, more interested in legacy than discovery.
I'm still very hungry for the life that I've always led.
But in a 1998 interview with Rolling Stone, he casually dropped a name that confounded expectations. "I like Radiohead a lot," he said. "They're not blues, but they're real." At a time when many of his contemporaries were openly dismissive of newer bands, Clapton's embrace of Radiohead spoke volumes. He wasn't simply keeping tabs on what was fashionable, he was connecting with something deeper. Authenticity, vulnerability, the willingness to push against commercial boundaries. These were values that had guided his own work, even when he'd stumbled. Radiohead, particularly in their post-OK Computer era, were tearing down the very conventions Clapton had once helped build. Where Cream had relied on virtuosity, Radiohead relied on atmosphere. Where Clapton had once wielded volume and distortion, Tom York wielded fragility. And yet the emotional result was strikingly similar. What Clapton saw in Radiohead wasn't a return to blues forms, but a return to emotional honesty. He had, by this point, lived through addiction, superstardom, personal tragedy, and tabloid scrutiny.
I couldn't get through a day without doing something to alter my consciousness.
And it started with heroin, the addiction.
It started with sugar.
Sugar.
Oh, yeah.
An artist like York, who sang about alienation, dread, and vulnerability, resonated more than one might think. Clapton had never been interested in artifice, and Radiohead's stripped-down sincerity, even when layered in electronica, felt refreshing. In interviews around the release of Pilgrim in 1998, Clapton talked about wanting to strip everything away and make something that felt honest and exposed. That ethos mirrored what Radiohead were doing on OK Computer and later Kid A. The connection wasn't stylistic, it was spiritual. Clapton had always followed the emotional thread in music, whether it was Delta blues, American soul, or British rock. By the late 90s, that thread led him to an Oxford-based band singing about modern alienation and digital decay. This was not a retreat into nostalgia, but a step into something unfamiliar. He didn't need another Robert Johnson. He needed a band that reflected his current state of mind. And so the guitarist who'd once electrified audiences with Cream now found solace in the dissonant, haunted beauty of a band whose sound was, on paper, miles from the blues, but in essence, the same.
They were very loud. I thought it was unnecessarily loud. A lot of it was just too much. They overemphasized whatever point they were making. Led Zeppelin took up our legacy, but then they took it somewhere else that I didn't really have a great deal of admiration for.